I'm Kate.
And I'm Liv.
And we're the hosts of Just Watch Me, a weekly podcast about iconic Canadian people, politics, and phenomena. We are two soon-to-be lawyers who have long believed our brunch chats were worthy of being recorded for the world to hear.
Even though no one asked, we're doing it. This podcast will bring you stories from the Giangameshi trial to the life and career of Miss Pamela Anderson. Join us as we reconsider what we thought we knew about Canada. Hear us wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show about Canadian culture and the way it informs this nation's history. My name is Patrick, and with me is my co-host and the gift under the tree that I'm most looking forward to unwrapping, Mackenzie.
I'm okay, I guess, now. A little disturbed now, but that's okay.
Look, I decided to make it, to at least make an opening that had some levity to it because of the nature of today's subject.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I have quotes from Thomas King later, maybe that I'll use that'll also add to the levity because he's a pretty funny guy.
Mm-hmm.
All in all, I think this will pretty much be the joke of the episode. Before we get started into the actual topic, just a reminder that you can support the show in a variety of ways. All the links are in the description. You can check out our Patreon. You can check out the recommended reading page. You can check out all sorts of cool stuff. And, you know, the holidays are coming up. So a $3 a month subscription to extra episodes for that CanLit history nerd in your family is really not a bad idea.
That's what I did.
Yeah, definitely. Did you really?
Yeah.
Nice. So it's just like self-supporting ourselves.
I mean, hopefully, I don't know if we got the kickback or not.
I actually haven't looked in a while. I'll check. Anyway, today we're kind of going off of the episode we started last week. Last episode, so 2 weeks ago, in which we talked about immigration specifically to Upper Canada in the 1830s. Kind of ended on opening the idea that it's all well and fine that these settlers felt hope in coming here and that they were genuinely searching and happy in starting a new life, but that this kind of migration definitely has some consequences to it, right?
Right.
And it certainly has some consequences when thinking about some of the rhetoric that the literature last week was promoting, in that Canada is an empty land, right? That's really where we kind of went off onto this idea that we're going to develop a bit further today in talking about treaties, right? Treaties with Native Americans. Specifically, we're going to be talking about today pre-Confederation treaties. So the treaties that started before 1867. Mm-hmm. And we're going to explain the distinction a bit later, but there is somewhat of a difference between the two ideas, right? So go into this knowing that we're going to be basically covering a 200-year period of treaty making between European powers and Native nations. And these treaties are various in all kinds of ways. And that the goal here is basically to cover the differences and changes that these treaties go to up until their modern iterations.
Yeah, and small disclaimer, like we're going to be using the word Indian a lot just because it's what pops up within the texts, within Absolutely. The treaties. They use the word Indian, so...
Definitely. If we quote the text, it's not because we ourselves like to use that term.
That we ever do.
No, obviously not.
It's just what's there.
Mm-hmm. Although, interestingly, speaking of Thomas King, he himself is a Cherokee writer, right? He's a Native American, and he doesn't mind using the term Indian. Just because I was actually reading a bit of his text before we started this, because of the idea that even if you do use more diplomatic terms, say like First Nations or Native American, indigenous populations, is that it's all a generalization, right? It was never a homogenized group of people. So ultimately it doesn't really matter what what term you're using. But still, we're still making that disclaimer just because it's an important one to make in general.
For sure. And it's true. It's like, it's the closest similarity I can think of is the same way that people from different provinces will sometimes say they're Albertans or Quebecois versus saying they're Canadian or whatever, but that's still a small similarity. It's still completely different than what our understanding of it is.
I guess the most obvious place to start is with a basic working definition of what a treaty is.
Mm-hmm.
So in your mind, Mackenzie, I guess I'll start the question off to you. How would you understand a treaty, just in its largest sense? And then we're going to kind of go specifically into natives and then pre and post Confederation.
Well, you have to look at it in the difference between a wartime treaty and then the treaties that we're going to be looking at.
Sure.
Because wartime treaties were strictly used between two nations at war as a declaration of peace, Treaty of Versailles and so on and so forth. Whereas the one we're looking at, the war wasn't so obvious between First Nations people and European settlers. They weren't in kind of conflict, or not the way we would think of it today.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand the version of treaties that we're going to be talking about are mostly used they're almost like bills of sales or something, They're almost like, we will take your land for such and such an exchange.
Yeah, that's certainly what they're going to become. Like that's worked as a basic definition for treaties with natives for the last, say, 200 years, more or less, right? However, initially, it is important to note that there were treaties, as you were mentioning, between these two groups of people, right? Native American nations and Europeans, that do fall under this category of peace treaties.
Yeah, of course.
And while there is that element of land that is implicit or sometimes explicit in those early treaties, right, it's not quite the same type of land treaty as you're mentioning now, although it will lead to that very directly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the distinction that we make, just segueing into that. That's kind of the distinction that generally historians and political scholars will make between pre and post Confederation, is basically the type of relations that are enforced in them, right? So as we're going to be talking about today, a lot of them are initially ones that established relations of trade or relations of peace or relations of war, and they kind of evolve, as you mentioned, into bills of sale, right? Or bills of that establish where natives are going to be moved to, or what they're going to get for land, all kinds of things like that. So there's a variety of types of treaties that inform the pre-Confederation catalog, if you will. Whereas post-Confederation, it's mostly going to be straightforward. We're taking this part of land, we're giving you this much money, and you're going to move here in exchange of that, on top of getting the money sometimes. And also just a maybe obvious point, but one that does need to be mentioned, pre and post Confederation treaties are not being dealt with the same people, right? One of them is dealing with French or British powers, whereas post Confederation, you're dealing with the Canadian government. This seems like a minor distinction, but it does change the name of the game a bit, and how
for sure,
how the Canadian government will react towards certain demands and so on and so forth.
It's a game changer. It's like a whole new system now.
Exactly, right? And sure, the Canadian government will model itself very heavily off of what it adopted or the legacy of the British Empire, but it's still something that needs to be distinguished, as we're going to touch upon much later when we get back to the post-Confederation treaties. But that's definitely something that we need to mention right off the bat. Now, another point of establishing that we need to kind of clear is kind of the differences in understanding of land and treaty making that these people were going into. Now, this is going to be developed throughout the episode, but there's a basic idea that we need to establish first and foremost between how, again, generally Indigenous populations viewed the land and how generally European settlers and colonialists viewed it.
There's a bigger difference than you think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. But I guess we could start with the European version just because we mentioned it at the start of the episode, right? And it kind of builds off of what we were saying last episode. there's an understanding that land is used for living on and it's used for agriculture, but the major difference that there's going to be with the Native American people is in its intent, right? What do you, how do you approach that land? As we kind of touched upon, Europeans and the British settlers that come here, or French settlers that come here, use it as an exploitation tool. You want to mine the resources, the wood, the earth, the whatever, to make a profit out of it. Or
there was a very strong notion of ownership in the European regarding of land.
Absolutely. It's capitalism, right? The whole point, right, is you're able to buy stuff so that you accumulate wealth or resources so that you can then buy more stuff. That's the
to get more wealth.
This idea that we're coming back to again, and we mentioned, is this idea of, not recognizing that there are people living here, right? That it's an empty land.
There's people.
Yeah, surprising as it may seem, right? But it's an extension of this idea of, well, look at all this forest and all these vast places that are not being exploited, right? Because an understanding of European ownership of land is that it's being used, right, or lived on. If nobody lives on it or actively uses it, it's not owned by anyone. Therefore, we can take it.
Therefore, there's also no point into holding it.
Exactly. That's an idea that goes, I think it was initially expressed in John Locke, although I'm not sure with this one. But if I remember correctly, like the modern, or at least that understanding of it, that direct understanding of it, comes from that rather famous philosopher John Locke, who was British in the 17th century. The difference, obviously, with natives is that no one individual owned the land.
No.
That does not mean that you could just walk in anywhere you wanted, right? But there was an understanding that it was more of a community-based thing, that certain people could take land that was from another, and you could kind of vary who owned it, and there was no real monetary transaction behind it. It was something that was a community ideal, and there was something that was given to you by gods or whatever cosmology was believed in. And there was a certain amount of respect that went into the land that was meant to be lived on as well, but lived on in a more philosophical sense of like, this is part of our lifeblood.
Yeah, and also like their idea of usage had no waste in it.
No.
When they used something, they used every part of it, and they only ever used as much as they need. There was that desire, that European expansionist philosophy is not present at all in First Nations cultures. There is not that same drive to expand, create the next big thing, make more.
Well, I guess one of the famous or well-known examples of this kind of efficiency with the land, right, is the rather famous example of agriculture in the Three Sisters, right, that they call it, is this idea, what was it? It was corn, beans, and squash, right? So basically you grew corn, and the beans would grow up the corn stalk, and the squash would form a base on which you could have a solid bean stalk or corn stalk. Right? So there was kind of this unity within what you grew and what you used that is definitely shown through these kinds of things. And that's not to say either that we're idealizing these native cultures either. They had some issues, of course, but that is by and large the general differences between how these two peoples viewed the land. Again,
like the First Nations, they lived humbly, humility, but they still had great cities. We know that the ruins, for example, say along the Mississippi River, indicate that there are cities where it was large and numerous in population as, say, London, maybe not even a couple hundred years before that point.
Yeah.
Or we know for a fact that we have found items and fossils on the coast of Mexico that would have come all the way from the Yukon, indicating that there was a large trade network that we did not know about, that these different tribes had with each other.
Absolutely. And there was also, you can look at less savory aspects also. For example, there was slavery in certain Native American populations that did exist, right? So there were
Central and South American ones.
Exactly, right? There's all kinds of things that we can compare that are more like European settlers, but that's the main sticking point that will definitely drive us through this idea of treaty making as it pertains to land and ownership.
Yeah, again, they didn't own the land, they were part of it. Whereas by this point, had sort of separated themselves from the reality or the differences of nature. They didn't consider themselves one of the species that belonged to nature.
They controlled nature. They were not natural, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is a tame version, but it's essentially supernatural in the sense that, in the most direct sense of the word.
Yeah. If we strip the comparison down to its most fundamental basic levels.
Yeah. Now, I think that pretty much settles the initial groundwork that we wanted to go with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with that, we can kind of go into our first peek at treaties. We're going to start in the early 18th century, not because there were no treaties as we described them before that, but because a lot of them were not written down. Mm-hmm. And they were very much oral based. It
was an honor system.
Yeah, it was an honor system. And or even if they were written, there is hardly any that survived up until now. And it kind of serves our purposes to start in the early 18th century because we have a much bigger wealth of proof with us, or at least actual documents that we can work with that still serve the purpose. Mm-hmm. The first one that I want to start off with is called the Great Peace of 1701, or sometimes referred to as the Great Peace of Montreal. Now, this was, as the name implies, a peace treaty between the French and the Iroquois nations. And this comes back to what we were saying in the initial part of the episode, is that for essentially the entire time that the French were in what we now know as Quebec, they had been at war with the Iroquois, right, who were not happy with them encroaching on their territory, naturally so. And also, the French were allied with the Hurons and the Algonquin people, who were enemies of the Iroquois. So that creates essentially a century, up until the point we're talking about today, of war between the French and Iroquois. And as Mackenzie said, at the start of the episode, it's not quite the same type of war as we're used to today. It's essentially, at best, it could be described as guerrilla warfare, would be a better example of what we're talking about now, right? The French established a fort. There was a kind of garrison going on. The Iroquois would come in from the forest, attack here and there, or all kinds of things. It was not a consistent thing.
Yeah, when they say war, what they're really saying is conquer, slaughter.
Yeah, totally. And, Iroquois attacking also, but a lot of it is defense or trying to stop the encroachment or this conquest. Right.
The encroachment of the white man.
Right. That's exactly. So in essence, right, and this is a time when I think a lot of the mentality behind such a long war is definitely comes from the fact that Europeans genuinely thought that they would wipe out the Native Americans rather quickly, right? Mm-hmm. They had guns after all. Germs helped a lot.
Germs did most of the work.
Exactly. But that's not to say that there were no Native Americans left by the 18th century, right? There were still a great deal of them in most of Canada, or what we now know as Canada, right? There were still great deals of their population. And by the 18th century, there was a lack of will, a lack of resources, and a lack of just men that wanted to keep fighting because it had been so long at this point. And the French and Iroquois decided to kind of cut their losses, is, I guess, the most basic way I can put it. Mm-hmm. Because at some point it gets long to do that. So the governor of New France then, Hector de Calière, kind of went out and said, okay, we need to stop this. I don't have enough men to keep going on this war. And it'll be easier to stop it right here. And make sure that there's peace not only between us and the Iroquois, but the Hurons and Algonquin and the Iroquois. The interesting thing before we get into the actual peace treaty, what it says, the Iroquois were kind of smart with this one. We're actually pretty smart with this one because they have a double treaty going on, pretty much, where they'll go and also make a deal with the British, who at the time were in what we now know as the United States.
13 colonies.
Exactly. So they'll go to them and say, look, we're making a deal with the French. We want to make a deal with you that'll be similar in nature. And basically, we won't get involved in your wars as long as you let us be. Right? And so they do this at the same time as they deal with the French. And so the Iroquois are just kind of taken off the map at this point, where they can be left in peace from the two great powers that are in North America now. And soon the only power. We'll see.
Yeah, and then let the two powers of North America fight each other instead. Better for the white men to kill each other than to kill them, which makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. It's actually a stroke of diplomatic genius. Like, it's actually pretty awesome. And I really like that story very much. But the whole goal of the French and Iroquois one that we're going to be talking about, the Great Peace, is it essentially ensures a mutual return of prisoners and an agreement that the successors of Hector de Calier, right, the governor, would only lead actions against the Iroquois if the Iroquois started another, if they broke that peace, basically, or if any nation broke that peace, then that's when war can start up again. But unless you do that, we're pretty much leaving each other alone. On top of that, right, what happens is, and this comes back to our idea of land, what happens is the Iroquois do have access to their hunting grounds around the Great Lakes, right, in Ontario or the northern United States. They still maintain access to their hunting grounds and trading grounds, and exactly that, they're not to intervene in the French-English wars, which were already starting to brew and conflicts were already starting to explode here and there, but not on the levels that we'll see later. That's the basic gist of it. We can still hunt on our grounds. You leave us be, and we'll return everyone. We won't attack you. And we can continue trading, but nothing violent. And let's leave it at that. I mean, pretty straightforward treaty, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Did you actually have a chance to read the treaty itself?
Yeah, you can already see the problems, the fact they still use the word the savages.
Oh yeah, I mean, still used. They just started using it in terms of history.
Yeah, it's something else.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting how they separate the savages and the Iroquois. Like, the savages are the allies, but they're still called savages, and then the Iroquois, who are their enemies, are still called the Iroquois.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a bit of a diplomatic, like a diplomatic move on the French part in that case. I'm really not sure. By the way, the links for this document that we're reading along with are going to be in the description, so you can check it out in English along with us. But yeah, I don't know if that's a little bit of a diplomatic maneuver on the French part to. Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't notice that. The Iroquois get named by name, and even that's apparently that's the wrong name because it means man killer. Yeah, and the savages, who are the French allies, don't. Oh, that's fascinating. I never noticed that.
It's also, I find it really, really interesting and you look at all of because each of the chieftains makes their reply saying, yes. Oh, I have no slaves to give back. Oh, I do, and I'll do this, blah, blah, blah. And in almost all of them, you see the words, my father, come up near the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Already the strong, spiritual link coming through.
There's a spiritual link, but also, if you notice at the very start of the document, right after the paragraph you looked at, right? As only the deputies of Huron-Wendat, a second paragraph after at Montreal, it is an extreme joy to see present all of my children here, right?
Mm,
This is the French writing, right?
yeah.
He's talking of the natives as children, right? And these are chiefs, by the way, that he's talking to. That he's not talking to any Joe Blow, which even then would be extremely condescending and paternalistic, but he's talking to the leaders of various Iroquois nations, and you're still calling them children, right?
Mm-hmm.
So despite this diplomatic maneuvering that we're mentioning of naming them the Iroquois, which Hector de Calières, I think, assumes is their actual name, and there's still this paternalism and this relation of power that is established in a supposed peace treaty.
Well, all of my children, too. To me, it's the my that gets to me, as if there's already this idea that they own them, you know?
Absolutely. It might not have been explicit that, yeah, exactly. It's an implied ownership of not just land in this case or power, but, people.
Mm-hmm.
And the French, even though we don't talk about it very much in terms of Canadian history, the French still own slaves in Canada. Right? It's not something that they were above.
Mm-hmm.
And there was definitely this relation or this idea that you could own these people, right? And that it's almost as if they're doing them a service by making this peace treaty rather than doing themselves one.
It's a favor, almost, you know?
Mm-hmm. Right. And this is a mentality that we're going to see coming up again and again in the treaties, but that has its roots in these kinds of early ones almost immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I also wanted to mention, you talked about the different responses from each of the leaders. Another thing that I noticed is the gifts that are given by the Native American leaders in these exchanges, on top of the already pre-established and the ones we discussed, or the hunting rights and the neutrality in wars and stuff like that. One of the things that the indigenous populations do is give gifts. For example, there was one by these 4 necklaces that we follow everything you have we have settled, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm giving you this to kind of solidify the treaty. Or there's another one where they were smoking pipes together, all kinds of things like that show the differences between how the indigenous people wrote treaties, and that is often by giving gifts to each other, and
Mm-hmm.
how Europeans did treaties, and that's writing it on a piece of paper.
It's a transaction.
Yes. It's a receipt. It really is, right?
Yeah.
It's absolutely a receipt, whereas the Iroquois are seeing it, and the Hurons, and are seeing it as the formations of new bonds, right? That's how they're operating right now.
What's interesting also is the language early on when he's talking about the bringing to peace. And I once again seize all your axes and all your instruments of war, which I place along with my own in a pit so deep that no one will be able to retrieve them, to trouble the tranquility that I reestablish among my children. It's very condescending and like parental in that way, you know, as if like, oh, kids, if you guys can't play nicely, I'm going to take all your toys away.
Yeah, definitely. I get the idea behind it. Okay, we're literally burying the hatchet in this case.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that it's written out is certainly with this idea that...
I also just love the idea he's going to bury his own, but he doesn't say in relation to his nation.
Yes. Okay. Interesting. Do you think that's deliberate?
I think there's definitely some sort of deliberateness to it. He's not placing the government... I mean, in the entire thing, he does not say he is representing the... Except for the very first line, he doesn't say he's representing France. He says, I, as the father of these unruly children, almost. The only mention is at the very beginning. And even then, it's just listing his title as Governor and Lieutenant General for the French. At no point does this treaty say that the words in it are a representation of the words of the King of France. As if the King of France could at any point that he decided to show up, tear up the treaty, and just start doing whatever he wants.
There probably is a question of implied authority here, but it's definitely something that we're going to see much more specified in the later treaties,
Mm-hmm.
that you're dealing with the entire government. But that's a very interesting point that you bring up, that it seems that you're dealing with, it looks like you're dealing with an individual rather than a system. And while it will be acted out as if they're dealing with a system, that use of language is certainly an interesting point to raise.
I just find it's a loophole, as if Chevalier de Carrier left and they got a new governor and lieutenant general, they have to rewrite the treaty, and then they could go in and ask for more.
Yeah, it turns out they don't have to do that, but it definitely leaves that door open. You could certainly leave that loophole. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think anything of the images at the bottom of the treaty itself?
What do you mean?
So I find it very fascinating that, and I understand like that's basically their way of signing, right? But I find the use of symbols to be very interesting, right? Because again, where this kind of goes off what you were saying, where Hector de Carrière would be speaking as an individual, right? These chieftains are speaking as a symbol. They're symbolically representing their whole nation, their whole band, right? In this whole thing, as represented by the images that they're drawing. They're not just a person, they are an idea, right? They're a group, a community speaking on behalf and as
speaking through one voice.
Yes. And I thought that is perfectly symbolized by the images at the end, which I thought was really cool.
There's definitely, and it highlights the major difference that these people have in their viewpoint. There's not a lot of thought for the individual. It's a very strong community bond, whereas the Europeans is very individual. You manifest your own life, own destiny.
Certainly. This kind of treaty will be the groundwork for most of, or at least the basic idea for most of French interactions with the native populations, right? That they are establishing trade relations, but that in essence, they still need these indigenous populations in order to live on the ground. The problem is, especially with a lot of these, and we're going to see this coming up again and again with the British, is there's very little enforcement, right? Because we've talked about this on the show, or at least I know I have, if you weren't there, is there are very few people, or there are very few French settlers that come onto the New France territory, which is massive. So oversight is very limited. So despite the fact that there are treaties like this that establish peace and trade relations, it becomes extremely hard to actually see how well they were respected by the population when you're on a frontier with pretty much no police oversight as we'd understand it, right? And not that there was like a general police force in New France, but I'm just saying like it's very hard to enforce these laws in New France. So it's all well and fine to say that they exist. Their efficacy can at least be put into doubt. I propose that we can move on to the Royal Proclamation.
Let's do it. Let's talk about Britain.
Yeah. So the Royal Proclamation, for just a quick refresher, basically sets the terms between the French and the English after the 7 Years' War, which lasted more than 7 years, ironically. But it basically sets the terms after the British, or the 13 colonies, right, fought against New France, and the British and the French fought in Europe. The British beat the French and took their colonies. And what the Royal Proclamation does is establish just that, exactly that. The British are taking over New France, are renaming it the province of Quebec, and they're basically saying, okay, here's how we're going to operate now. Interestingly enough, right, there's a big section on the Native Americans, right, in this in this document, right? The bottom half of the document is mostly pertaining to, or at least about the middle, is mostly pertaining to Native Americans, right?
It's something, all right. The British do love to write things.
They love to write things down and make themselves seem important.
And make themselves seem like the good guys.
Right. But interestingly enough, there are some scholars that refer to this document as a kind of Magna Carta for indigenous populations, because for some people its origins were they had some good intentions, but ultimately the fact that it would later go by the wayside kind of disproves this idea of a Magna Carta for Native Americans. Right? Probably as it was originally written, you could make that argument, but very quickly that would go by the wayside, because in essence what the section on Native Americans, or Indians as they call them in the Royal Proclamation, what it says is that, so the British take over, right? We're taking over New France. We're taking over the maritime colonies. Anything that we are not mentioning in this text, so basically everything west of the Great Lakes, is Indian territory. That's the basic conceit. Like they say it over the course of about 6 paragraphs, because as you say, the British love to write. But the essential idea of it is that what we'd understand in Canada, right, historically as Rupert's Land, all that whole territory that was occupied and allowed to be traded on by the Hudson's Bay Company, that's land that the native populations are allowed to live on, right? And, act as they always have. Interestingly enough, and we're going to deconstruct this a bit further, like we can talk about it further, but I just want to get this out there. There is no mention of natives on the territory of the province of Quebec itself, or the 13 colonies, right? It is a non-issue.
Did they just disappear? Did they go poof?
According to the British, pretty much. The basic idea behind it is that it was irrelevant. It was not a point that was relevant to make, because they were there to stay, right? The British were there. We own this land, right? This idea of ownership comes back. You can have everything else. We are here. And while they probably know, or I hope they know at least, that that there are Native American people on the territory they're living on right now, it's not a question of what their rights are. They don't care. They're living under British rule, and that's that. That obviously brings up a whole set of other questions, because what are Native American rights, for example, under British rule, is not explained. Right? It doesn't.
So many problems.
There are a lot of.
You gotta give it to the Romans. When they conquered a people, everybody got Roman citizenship. At the very least.
I mean, if you acted like a Roman, you did, unless you were still a barbarian. They died.
But even even the First Nations people that tried to act like the British still got the short end of the stick.
And that's something that's going to come up later in the 19th century, when litigation is going to start happening, and questions that we're raising here are going to try to be answered, right? Because that's a huge gap. It's a huge blind spot in this supposed Magna Carta, is what do we do with the people that still live here? It's all well and fine that you're allowing us our rights where you're not there yet. Yet is the operative word. But what do we do with those that are still here? And the answer
you're
is
allowing us.
Yeah, but that is it, right?
No, I love the way that they're like, we will allow you to live, to settle on our land. It's like, when did you take this land? You didn't even buy it.
Nope.
For a nation of contracts and receipts, you guys didn't buy shit for Quebec.
We bought it with guns.
And blood and warfare and germs.
Yeah, pretty much. There is something interesting that I think we should bring up with the Royal Proclamation, right? And that, again, sets the groundwork for every treaty that's going to be coming up for the foreseeable future. And that's the idea that they're aware, the British are clearly aware, right? They say it explicitly in the Royal Proclamation, whereas great frauds and abuses have been committed in purchasing lands of the Indians, and to the great prejudice of our interests, and to the great dissatisfaction of the said Indians, in order therefore to prevent such irregularities in the future, blah, 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 we do enjoin and require that no private person do presume to make any purchase from said Indians of any lands reserved to the said Indians. They go on to explain basically that the Native Americans and the British government can only deal with themselves. Right? That it is only in the power of the Crown to buy land.
Which kind of kneecaps them a bit.
Yes. It certainly does remove some power from the natives. Absolutely. It does show, however, a certain awareness that there were problems with the way that the French did it, right? That I kind of mentioned at the start, right? There's very little oversight or very little possibility of ensuring that this peace treaty is enacted or well respected, right? And so,
I mean, if you want to take the optimistic look at it,
yes, I'm giving it a certain benefit of the doubt, even though I know that there will be
Britain.
A series of issues. Absolutely, it's Britain. They have already here a track record of screwing people over. Like, I'm just saying that the idea behind it could seem interesting. They will screw it over regardless, but it could be regarded as interesting, right?
Yeah, no, if there was, the problem is that economy and the power of the dollar and the pound is on the rise, So instead of giving First Nations peoples the power to purchase, to acquire wealth, and I mean like true, real wealth, the British government's giving themselves the monopoly on whatever land.
It's basically giving the illusion that they have choice, but as you say, they're kneecapping them.
It's the illusion that the British government's there to be their friend, to help them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're going to help you do all these big scary transactions because we know the evil merchantmen are just going to rob you blind, as the British say as they proceed to rob them blind.
Yes, but again, the basic conceit is not wrong. There were issues on the frontier with, for example, American settlers in the 13 colonies.
Oh, for sure.
That were screwing over big time. But as you say, it's hypocrisy.
I mean, the real solution would be to assign people from the British government to take part in the negotiations to make sure the deal was square. And then the British government takes a small cut of the sales revenue or a sales tax or something like that.
But that's essentially what they're going to try to do a bit later. But again, by that point, it's no longer a fair trade because by then the British dominate so clearly in the region that the levels of power are just so uneven that they could basically make whatever deal they want.
And so again, we see the British enacting their plan too little, too late.
Exactly right. So,
shocker.
Good idea in principle. In reality, we know that it's just bullshit. Like, damn it. Also, and this kind of goes behind the scenes of including the natives in the Royal Proclamation, is that there's still an awareness that there is a threat there's a potential threat in Indigenous populations, which, as I just alluded to, will become less and less threatening as we go along.
Well, there's this idea that they're not allowed to integrate now. And, if they were allowed to engage in real negotiations and work with independent settlers and merchants, they could have integrated. The First Nations people could have integrated with the British colonies and saved a lot of trouble. But Britain is legitimately just segregating them and saying, you can only deal with us.
This is interesting that you bring that up because before the Royal Proclamation, there was an uprising by Pontiac, right? The famous Pontiac rebellions had just happened, right? So there was a distinct awareness by the British, not only of their threat, but that of exactly as you mentioned, their distinction from the British. They're actively working against us, right? Or at least that's the rhetoric, that's the mindset that they're operating under. So we need to make sure that we're on a quote unquote even playing field with this piece of paper. But yeah, I still find, despite its glaring problems, I find this piece of legislation to be absolutely fascinating because despite the fact that it was written, 300 years ago? Almost a little over than that, but is this idea that it was so influential in how basically the British government would deal with the Native American populations since then, because as we're going to see, the various treaties that they're going to go about them are going to be progressive variations of this very text.
Right.
Which I thought was really cool. However, just before we take a quick break and transition into the 19th century, right, I want to quote something from Thomas King, right, from his book, The Inconvenient Indian.
Oh, yay. I love that title.
Yeah, it's great. By the way, readers, I'll put it in the recommended reading list. It's a fantastic book. It's basically an account of Native Americans getting screwed over in Canada and the US forever. But it's great. And it does make light of certain things because Thomas King is a comedic writer. And so he does add a bit of flavor to a lot of these things that could be potentially dry and sad.
Flavor.
But he does bring up in that book this idea of treaty making in the late 18th and early 19th century, as we're in the era we're talking about now, which I think perfectly transitions us into this idea of, look, what we're offering the natives, to, okay, no, that's it. It's time to talk business and screw you over. Right?
Yeah.
So listen to this. For 250 years, whites and Indians had fought as enemies, had fought as allies, had made peace, had broken the peace, and had fought each other again. But when Great Britain, France, and the newly formed United States, he's talking a bit later, obviously, sat down to hammer out the details of the Treaty of Paris that would officially end the American Revolution, who had Native people were neither invited to the negotiations nor mentioned in the treaty itself. So long, and thanks for all the fish.
Okay, it doesn't actually say so long and thanks for all the fish, does it?
Yes.
When was this written?
A few years ago, 2012.
So that's okay. Okay, so like he's obviously quoting the book.
Yes.
By Douglas Adams.
Yes, he's quoting The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Okay, he's quoting the book. So long and thanks for all the fish, actually. So
nice, good one. But yeah, he basically goes on to say Indians were mentioned in what we're going to talk about soon, the Treaty of Ghent, which tidied up the War of 1812. And we'll see what that implies, but he says Article 9 basically ensures that all hostilities toward nations of Indians will stop. And he goes on to say the Americans more or less forgot about this particular article as soon as they signed the treaty. But anyone watching the film shouldn't have been surprised.
And we're back.
Hey! As we were talking about before the break, the next section we're going to address is from the War of 1812 onward.
Yay!
So a big part of the issues that were raised by the Royal Proclamation, aside from the fact that it completely ignores natives on their territory, is that a lot of American settlers were unhappy with the fact that they couldn't move west unless they had the accord of the government. So that was one of the major reasons behind the American Revolution, among other things, right, along taxes and so on and so forth. But this idea of being free to deal with others as you see fit and not have to go through the British government was definitely one of them.
Fucking taxes.
Especially tea taxes. Those are the worst.
But that's jumping the gun just a little bit. Wrong country.
No,
just don't tax our maple syrup. We'll be fine.
Yeah, that's a whole other issue. The Federation of Maples. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
We'll talk about the Maple Reserve another day.
Eventually, in like 12 years, when we'll get to that episode.
Yeah.
The point is, so there are already issues with settlers on the frontier with this inability to move west, right? Or as freely as they would like. One of the reasons that the Americans revolted. As we move further along in time, we see similar things keep happening as the War of 1812 gets closer, right? And one of the first battles in the War of 1812, which some people view as a kind of American Revolution 2.0, is this land-based claim that Native Americans on British territory had a right to this land. This was near Upper Canada, or what would be it was what would become known as Upper Canada, and American settlers who wanted it. And basically, there was an armed conflict that emerged over the inability of American settlers to take that land. So intrinsic to the War of 1812, but not really touched upon, is the fact that people wanted to take more and more Native American territory, right?
Right.
Another thing that we should add here is that during the War of 1812, Native Americans, and most famously, right, on the British side, Tecumseh, are absolutely integral to the British strategy, right? They do ally with the British, in part because they see them as somewhat better than the already perceived as assimilatory Americans.
Only somewhat better, though.
Yes, somewhat is an extremely necessary caveat here.
The stories, anyway, that you can read are very fascinating about how much fear there was of the First Nations people.
Oh, yeah, immediately. So there was this whole rhetoric of them either not integrating, or if you want an idea of how people talked about Native Americans, look no further than how people talk about Islam today in a post 9/11 world, right? It's very much this dehumanized kind of language that is used, right? That's obviously oversimplifying it, but it's a modern example that can be very well understood.
Well, even the difference is, though, that the Americans nowadays want to hunt Islamic terrorists, but they were afraid of First Nations warriors.
Yeah.
The stories of battle cries causing soldiers to flee as if First Nations people are just full-on monsters. It makes me laugh just in consideration with the letter that we read that said, "Oh, I haven't met any savages. I just met these really nice Native American people that have been like helping me out and like doing nice little transactions with me."
Surprising as it may seem, if you don't push a population to attack you, they're actually nice to you most of the time.
If you don't try and destroy their entire people and culture, they
Right.
might be nice to you. Surprise, surprise, Britain.
Wow.
Shocker.
Funny you should actually mention those letters, because another thing that is going to be radically important in talking about the new wave of treaties that arrive with the 19th century is the massive arrival of agricultural settlers in Canada and in the US as well. But whereas, as we've established in New France and even in early province of Quebec era Canada, there were very little people, right? And it's only with the 19th century that we will see massive influxes. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people that will just pour into Upper and Lower Canada. In part because of things that are happening in Britain, which we've talked about on the last episode, if you want to check that out, right? There are all kinds of reasons why.
Fun times.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it's all these series of things that are happening around 1812, 1813, 14 that make it necessary to rethink how British and American powers interact with Native people. So in 1815, as we mentioned with the Thomas King quote, there is the Treaty of Ghent that is signed, right? I think Ghent is in Austria.
Ghent.
I forget where it is exactly, but the point is it ends the War of 1812. However, as we also established, Native Americans aren't really consulted or hardly even mentioned. Right?
Surprise, surprise.
Right.
They're only in Article the 9th.
That's it. That's all. So
And they're mentioned twice, the word Indian.
There are 11 articles for reference in the Treaty of Ghent, and the only two references in that very article of the 9th one is to say the Americans promise to stop hostilities and the British promises to stop hostilities. That's all you get. You don't get certain rights are protected, whatever those may be. You don't get anything
rights. Well, it's even more to say, we're going to stop fighting with you if you stop fighting with us. Okay, you guys were the aggressors, obviously.
It's like, but you have to take, it's up to the natives to take the moral high ground on this one, obviously.
Always.
Anyway, that's harsh, but what this does, basically, there's very little to say about the treaty itself and more of the context surrounding it. And what it basically does is reinforce the ideas that were, or at least the borders and ideas that were set into place with the Royal Proclamation, right? We're just restating, okay, there are a lack of hostilities and we're returning to the status quo that was established with the Treaty of Paris and the Royal Proclamation. If we want to look at direct treaties between Great Britain and the natives, it's a bit more accurate to look at something like the 1818 Rice Lake Treaty, which is increasingly, once again, starting to look like what we're looking at today with treaties, right? With the modern version of treaties, as we'd understand them.
The modern idea.
Yeah. Because essentially what that piece of legislation will do is buy off a pretty sizable section of land, although not the biggest they'll ever buy, a pretty sizable section of land in Upper Canada, not surprisingly near Rice Lake. And we'll basically say that, look, here is a certain amount of money, right, that we're going to give the chiefs or the nations every year, an annuity, right? And you can live on this reserve over there, but we get to keep this land here that we're buying. Right?
And we swear we're going to keep giving you your annual money that we owe you. We're definitely going to keep to that promise.
Surprisingly enough, that annual promise is not, while you're right, a lot of it will be forgotten or renegotiated, if you want to put it in a more diplomatic term.
I don't, but sure.
No, obviously not, because why would you? But the idea is that what's actually, funny enough, going to be most forgotten over time is the creation of reserves, right? That's what's going to be lost first. So what the British are doing basically with Rice Lake is setting up this idea, okay, we're giving money, we're giving land where you could live off. That's not here. But these reserves are, over the 1820s and 30s, going to be kind of put to the wayside in favor of just giving money to nations and just letting them figure it out for themselves.
That's a point of contention. That's an interesting, oh boy, that's a thing to talk about. Because
the initial idea, right, as in case it's not obvious, we're not agreeing with what the British are doing in this case of buying off land that they think is good enough for them but not good enough for the natives, right? But the initial idea of saying, okay, well, at least you get this land over here, again, has definitely its problems, but it's not the worst idea in the world, right?
No, not at all.
It could be definitely better, especially when we consider that a lot of these, like we hear a lot in modern Canada of the poor conditions of the reserves and so on and so forth, is there's very little oversight once they get into reserves. They basically just put natives on them and say, figure it out. So it's barely better than just letting them not have a reserve in the first place.
Which is why it's nice in the Yukon territory, there actually is no reserves as we know them. I don't know. I think that might be true for other territories. I don't know that for sure, though. But it's an interesting thing that I know for a fact in the Yukon.
Oh, interesting. That's something that obviously with the show I want to study more, and I'm going to. But I know surprisingly little about the Yukons and the territories and how they operate or how they came into being. It's not something that's been on my radar. But that's very interesting. I didn't know that.
Something I learned a couple summers back when I worked there.
Right. Yeah. Rice Lake Treaty is one of many, but it's definitely like a template that you can observe in this model that the British are working under, right? So you're buying land in Upper Canada, more and more to the northwest, more and more to the north. Anywhere that you can put British settlers, you will, basically. And you see similar things happening in Lower Canada or Quebec, although lands are more fertile in northern Ontario than they are in northern Quebec. So there is that drive a bit more in Upper Canada to create treaties like this. Just to give a sense of how much money we're talking about here, I think in one of the treaties that I saw, in essence, the British government refuses to give for the land more than £1 per head on that nation.
Well, I thought that's what they wanted to do, and then the British said no to that deal, and then that's how they came to the deal that they have now.
That's very,
I'm
very
trying
possible.
to remember it correctly.
That's
It's
very
so
possible.
crazy.
Regardless of the exact details, the point is that's how they're operating, right? They're like, okay, how many people are there? We're going to give you a vague amount, right? That theoretically, although not always, theoretically is going to be respected and given on a yearly basis, right?
Lol.
In which the hope, right, is not only that you can live on the reserve, but kind of integrate into this capitalist system that we're putting up here, right? In which you'll be able to use money to buy stuff and kind of learn to grow up and exist and assimilate within the economy that we're setting up in Canada.
The problem is you can't assimilate if you're stuck on a certain plot of land that you're not allowed to leave.
Yeah.
Or that's one problem anyway.
That's
one of many.
That's certainly one problem. The idea of what rights they have and whether they're considered legal Indians or status Indians, as we understand it today, is not yet a question. They're just there. They're just pushed to the side. At this point, at this point in the early 19th century, it's not really a question as to whether or not they're quote unquote status Indians, right? Because there's very little voting power from most of the population, let alone natives, so it's not even brought up.
No, and I'm not saying I want them to have voting rights. I'm saying you brought up the point where they have to assimilate, right?
Yes.
Their assimilation and integration is the goal. But that can't happen if they are segregated to certain reserves and plots of land.
Yes. I agree. And I was adding on to that point by saying, like, they're not even given the opportunity to further extend that by defining what their rights are. It's just, you're over there, and that's it.
Well, it's also, if you look at the size of the treaties, you can look and you can, like, it lines out the different sizes for all the different ones for some of them, and they give miles, and like they're 27 miles maybe for one of them. For Hamekwone-Chung, I just butchered that, I know I did, and his band, a tract of land to commence 7 miles from the mouth of the river Magana to Wang, and extending 6 miles east and west by 3 miles north. That's 18 miles. This is these are a people that learn to live and use hunting grounds and farming grounds over large tracts of land. It's like what happens when you put animals in cages at a zoo. Like, let's not mince words. Like, that's what's happening right now.
It's horrible. It's dehumanizing, and no one seemed, or at least at the time, no one was really caring. No. There was some backlash. There is some noted backlash, but it's so minimal that it's, might as well say, imperceptible.
Well, it's also, if you look at the backlash that people do bring up or start to bring up near the end of the 19th century, they're treating them again more like fascinating topics, like they're endangered animals, than they are people that need to be saved, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And this comes back to this idea that we were talking about last episode of Malthusianism, right? Mm-hmm. This idea that certain populations, if you keep aiding them, or if you keep them alive, despite their huge air quotes, right, despite their evolutionary kind of disabilities, in this case, as the rhetoric of the time enforced, that they're just going to disappear. And it creates all kinds of myths about, namely, the noble savage and stuff like that. It's absolutely horrible. Savage. But yeah, exactly. But that's where you kind of see that grow, is in this super racist rhetoric that's formed. Right?
Mm-hmm. I don't want to. I know I'm getting very on it, but I don't want to mince words. You know, if we're gonna say fuck Durham on the behalf of the French people, we have to acknowledge, like, this is just straight up like racism.
It's genocide, man.
It's genocide. It's full-on slavery, captivity, almost.
There's no other way to say it. This is what it is. And you can code it in any nice rhetoric that you want. This is pretty much what it is.
And you're giving them land that was theirs to begin with.
Yes! I can't stress this enough. We can't stress this enough. You're allowing them to live on stuff that was already theirs. This, I guess, is a kind of a pretty decent segue into the last treaty that we're going to talk about, which happened in 1850, right? are known as the Robinson Treaties.
Oh, yes. This is the one that had the per person. I checked it, and we'll go over it when we get to it.
Right. But this idea of pretty much the Robinson Treaties will be the final version as we know it today. For
The
various
nail in the
reasons.
coffin.
Yes, so to speak, although Robinson himself, who was a fur trader appointed by the British government to deal with natives, he was, for all intents and purposes, he seemed like someone who had genuinely good intentions, but again was working within a system that was just horrible. So there's little value in saying like, oh, he was a good guy, but it's still horrible what he's enforcing.
It's also, again, like, what do his good intentions actually mean? If his good intentions are to save the noble savage, or this idea that the savage is some sort of like almost an endangered species, you're missing the point, my dude.
Yes.
Absolutely. You are missing the point by a country mile.
Just to kind of open up to this idea, right? I want to quote once more from Thomas King, just because it very much indicates what we're talking about here, right? And it goes off what you were just saying. So we just established that certain reservations are put into place by the British government in exchange for buying off land. However, as Thomas King points out, throughout the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, people still were coming in, and that required buying off more and more land and pushing these people. So it was saying, he's talking about Francis Bond Head, who at the time was Governor General of Canada, just before Durham, actually. He's talking about how Head had this really paternalistic notion that Native Americans needed protection from the white man. As you were saying, this idea that, you know, they're an endangered species that need to be put into a zoo.
God.
And the most effective way to accomplish this, King writes, was to move them far away from white settlement. So had forced the surrender of some 600,000 hectares of land in Ontario that was held by bands of the Ojibwe. They were moved to what is now Bruce Peninsula with the promise that the area would be protected from white encroachment. And then he writes another paragraph, forever. 20 years later, the Niwash Band was forced to give up its 4,000 hectare reserve once again to make way for more white expansion. This was followed by further surrenders in the 50s and 1850s and 60s. I say we're putting you over there, but the limits of where over there is are constantly being pushed back. They're constantly being renegotiated or redictated. The terms of the settlement are being redictated constantly.
Yeah, they're basically keeping them as nomadic people almost by making them move around so much.
Yeah, pretty much. But again, they're treating them as this really large and common entity when, again, they were not all like that. And it's extremely noticeable with these Robinson treaties. Where
I thought of a better comparison for that. And it's like when you call somebody Asian, and the fact is they could be from Vietnam, North Korea, South Korea, China, Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, any country from Southeast Asia. They could be Indian. Yeah.
It's so vague and unnecessarily so. Anyway, and that's another example of imperialist rhetoric, right? That's kind of promoted throughout the generations, right? You can see it, or before that, before we now use Asian, it was Oriental, right? The term.
Oh God.
Even when we refer to Africa as a general thing, right? Or even when you say, to an extent, the West, as if it's a whole unified concept. To an extent, yes, but it's so disingenuous, right? Whenever you just merge all these groups together into one idea or ideal or idealized version of it that you find it easy to think about, removes the complicated nature of human beings. But anyway, we digress. The point that I wanted to bring up with the Robinson Treaties is that it's relatively similar to what we see in Rice Lake, but the scale and details are changed somewhat, right? In the sense that where until the Robinson Treaties, throughout the 19th century, you'll see relatively small sections of land being bought off. Talking about here, hundreds of acres at a time, 1,000 acres, 2,000, that kind of thing around Upper Canada. What happens with the Robinson Treaties is that they basically organize the takeover of a bigger section of land than had ever been done before, right?
Yeah, they gave up the pretense.
Absolutely. So that's why I said when people say that Robinson was a relatively nice guy, because there are examples of him in which Native people come to him after the treaty had not been respected. He's like, well, okay, well, no, fight for your rights and stuff like that. But when you see shit like this happening, it kind of removes, I think, from the genuine, kind of makes it disingenuous, I find.
Yeah, this idea that he's a genuine person.
Yes. Because what they'll basically do is basically negotiate for hundreds of thousands of hectares, which include so many different nations. What the Robinson treaties will do is that instead of dealing with one nation at a time, they're basically amping up the rate at which they negotiate these treaties to cover massive amounts of land and massive numbers of nations. Another thing that you just mentioned not that long ago, Mac, is this idea that they are now giving out the money to not to communities or to band leaders. They're giving them out to individuals.
Well, okay, so that's one of the things that happened actually with the Robinson treaties is that, so Robinson was given 7,500 pounds to get as much land as he can, which back in the day would have been a significant sum. So he went to negotiate with the Aboriginal nations living around Lake Superior and Lake Huron.
Yes.
So his proposal was a one-time payment of 4,000 pounds to be doled out, I guess, among the tribes, and then 1,000 per year afterward for the territory around the lakes.
Yep.
The Lake Superior group said, we're completely okay with this. The Lake Huron wanted instead to get 10 pounds per person, and they wanted a larger reserve tract.
Yeah.
And Robinson said no.
Absolutely.
He then went to, this is how he got his eventual one, was 2,000 pounds to Lake Superior with a 500 annum.
Yep.
And then he went south to Lake Huron and said, Lake Superior's already signed over. How about I give you guys 2,000 and then 600 per annum? And then they signed that deal.
Yeah, that's exactly how it went down. What I was referring to on top of that was that even the payouts that you're referring to were kind of separated between individual groups, right? Like within the nations, I mean.
Yeah.
So it adds this, it basically separates or individualizes groups that initially thought, as we touched upon in the Great Peace Treaty, that thought in terms of community mindedness, right? It is one more way in which they are broken down into individuals instead, right?
Yeah.
Which is a massive kick in the balls, I'd say.
It's a massive something, that's for sure.
Right. And I'm genuinely unsure about how much this was a deliberate choice or just something that happened because they were not thinking about it and they were not thinking through about it. But I do think that it's something that had a horrible effect in that sense. In every other sense also.
In every sense. Definitely. Overall, everything was horrible.
Essentially, with this Robinson Treaty, and this takes us to about 1850, this model will pretty much be followed until the last treaty is signed in 1923. That's pretty much what the model is going to be like as we go into Confederation and as the Canadian state moves west and north.
That's a fun thought to go with.
I'm not going to end it on there. I just
even in general, it's just like, oh, this is the model we're going to be using for the next while. Right. And it's like, well, that's okay, sure.
Very disappointing, but if you insist, because the thing is, as they're putting these treaties into effect, right, it gives the state, whether it's British or Canadian, more and more leverage, right? Because suddenly you have this land, and it kind of forces and restricts the native populations at a much faster rate than their previous treaties of the last 200 years ever had.
Right.
So the rate at which, while it was an initially relatively slow process to gain the upper hand over native communities, right? As we saw, the British and the French still recognized the indigenous populations as either a threat in war or as a noteworthy population. there's kind of an exponential growth in the power of the state to exert itself over these nations as they go along with this type of model that the Robinson Treaty explains, which I find fascinating.
If you say so.
Again, not endorsing it, but it is a fascinating thing to think about.
It is fascinating, the fact that this was this idea that seems to perpetuate within the colonies, that you just need the one idea and then you can roll with it in forever.
Yeah.
Looking at you, Constitution, Second Amendment.
The United States Constitution, I assume.
Yes.
Good.
Not our Constitution that not every province has signed.
We're not going to get into that one.
Not yet.
No, we're not.
We'll talk about Mr. Trudeau eventually.
Oh boy. Which one? Father or son? Or both?
Or both. Pick. Take your pick, really.
I mean, you could relate it back to the Native Americans if you want to talk about both, but...
Well, yeah, because there was the guy that stood up.
Not just that, but I mean, Trudeau's son, his whole... a big part of his platform was to bring clean water to certain reservations that it's been 25 years that they don't have clean water. And, like, nothing ever happened of that.
Oh, Trudeau.
Yeah. Anyway,
Trudeau.
The point is, if there is a point to all this, right?
Fury, anger, that is the point.
Yeah. What we talked about today, right? We talked a lot about what the treaties represent, but as what I'm hoping to do, right? We never really talked about the reactions to those treaties. We talked a bit about King, which is a modern reaction, but the actual response by Native communities is mostly going to be happening, or at least on a noteworthy scale, by the late 19th century, right? And that's where we're going to be talking about in a post-Confederation. So please don't add us or whatever because we didn't talk about their response. Because for now, not only is it not massive, but the British don't care. They're not at a stage where they give a shit. So
when do they ever care?
They start to care when it becomes a bit more of a public display. But really then, the point is, it's something that we're going to bring up in future episodes, not now. Now I mostly wanted to set the groundwork of what treaties were.
What they mean for Canada and in Canadian history.
Exactly. I guess one of the questions that we can one of the many that we can end on is open up to this idea, right, of just to kind of bring it back to the literariness of it is, what do you think of the language of the documents in general? Right. How would you describe it in either its intent or its how they were followed or respected or perceived by either party? Right.
It's, how do I articulate this? I guess you could say the issue at hand is it's very much two-faced. You know, these treaties were a very convenient way to say, oh, we're giving you fair deal, we're giving you this, we're giving you that, when they weren't. I mean, you look at the writing for these treaties, you know?
Yeah.
And it's very much, oh, we, in response to the First Nations people, do declare such and such.
Yes.
When, don't know if that ever actually happened, but here we are.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? Which kind of brings me to the way I kind of side, and you can gather more thoughts because I just kind of sprung that question on you. But while these treaties seem clear in the way that the language is written, right? We mentioned a few excerpts here and there, but the language is written in a officialized way, right? There's a lot of it that is still open to interpretation and that lacks explicitness, which leaves it open to these loopholes and to this possibility to not respect the treaties, right? And there are all kinds
But that would never happen.
Right, but it does open the door to the litigation that I'm talking about, right? That happens starting in the later 19th century of people saying like, hey, well, no, you're not respecting this, or this was not the terms of our agreement, which not only points to the lack of detail in some of these things because no one thought that it would ever come up again. And also it points to the different different levels of understanding that the two parties, in this case, if we can refer to it as two parties, even though it's multiple nations and governments, right, how they were operating going into these treaties.
Mm-hmm.
Because as we mentioned at the start of the episode, right, the initial treaties were perceived as either peace or settling disputes. Right? This and the conceptions of land were completely different.
Right.
But by the time, so it definitely changes how you go into it, right? Because you think, for example, if you're an Indigenous person, you don't necessarily think that you're going to lose anything. You're just establishing a working relationship. But
That was the belief.
That was the belief, exactly. But as you're going into the later 18th and early 19th century, that relationship of power obviously is noticed by the natives, but by then it's too late to act on anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just bringing it back to the language of the documents, a lot of this, I think, comes from the fact that, or at least this lack of explicitness comes from the fact that the British, I think at that point, don't care to be detailed because they don't think they need to.
No, they most certainly don't.
And that's so indicative of the type of mentality and perception that they're operating under, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's pretty much my takeaway from these early documentations.
I'd go with that.
And there's a lot to say as we go along and how they're responding, and what the courts and Supreme Courts, as they'll eventually develop, will decide is officialized and not, and what it means. It's a whole thing. But in establishing the groundwork, I think that's pretty much how we can see it, broadly speaking.
Makes sense to me.
Is there anything else that you wanted to touch upon out of anything? Because we've still been talking for a while. Fascinating conversation. I don't mind continuing. But is there anything that you wanted to either cap off with or open up to?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it'd be nice for people to try and read these original texts, to really try and understand what this language really means.
Yeah.
You can get them all on the Canadian government website.
Yes.
Which, good on Government of Canada for making this all available so people can take a look and see what happened.
Also good on them. A big source of information for this episode was the government's, and you can argue like that it's a jaded version, but a lot of it has explanations of the context in which these things were written.
Yeah.
So that's pretty good on them, and I'll link them all in the description.
Yeah, and there's no, as far as I can tell, there's nothing that says that First Nation got good deals or bad deals. It's very sort of neutral in its writing, which is nice.
Yes.
And I do highly recommend, because these are the types of things, especially in today's climate, that everybody should be reading. Everybody should be understanding where these treaties came from, where the idea of reserves came from, and why there's so many issues with them today.
Mm-hmm. And they're not very long.
No.
So they do make for quick reading. It's not like the commissions that we see today that are interminable and last hundreds and hundreds of pages because of all the research and stuff like that went into them. They're very straightforward for the time, at least. We poked fun at the flowery language, but for the time, they're relatively straightforward and are so insightful nonetheless. So yeah. I
read them all this morning to show you.
Yeah. And we're recording just after lunch. So that gives you an idea of the time frame we're talking here.
But yeah, I think you need to look at these things for yourself, come to your own conclusion about what it means to you, what you sort of believe we can do to change things. Again, we're just two white boys talking out of our butts.
As we always do.
Yes.
I do actually, I felt less bad talking about it today because it was a further historical context. Mm-hmm. But I do for the more modern treaties. And when we talk about reservations and stuff I do actually want to get Native American or Indigenous people onto the show. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Which I think would be extremely insightful beyond just the research that we're able to do and our interpretation as we did in this episode, our reactions to treaties as we see them, but how it was lived in a modern context, I think would be extremely insightful to get a First Nations person on the show. Mm-hmm. how I want to finish off, right? Unless you had other stuff to say.
Nope.
Is I have a series of questions that were kind of left ambiguous by these various treaties that I think are so penetratingly insightful as to just how little thought people actually gave them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And these cover all the treaties we talked about today, but we have like 5 or 6 questions that we can kind of open up to the fact that they'll be attempted to be answered as the centuries go along to varying degrees of success.
They gave it the old college try.
Sure. So, first question. Did the proclamation create Aboriginal title or rights, or merely protect it as an existing right? Not really answered. Did the British government intend the proclamation to apply to undiscovered, quote unquote, undiscovered areas of North America? Who knows? What is the nature of Aboriginal rights on the reserve lands in treaty and non-treaty areas? We still don't know that yet in the context of the episode. And what is the nature of their rights on the reserves?
Or off the reserves. There's an important distinction there. There's a very important distinction.
Yep. None of these questions are answered. They will.
You want to know why they weren't answered? British mindset of the time was, why would you care about the opinions of animals?
That's putting it mildly. So this episode
was... that's a very mild way to put it.
Yeah, this episode was kind of a downer to finish on before Christmas. We might... but I think it was a very pertinent episode to follow up from our last one.
Mm-hmm. If you're looking for a more Christmassy episode before the holidays, check out our Pop Canada series, where we have a very, what I believe is an unbelievably touching, heartwarming, and joyful Christmas-themed episode about Michael Bublé and Canadian Christmas traditions.
Absolutely. It's a load of fun. And again, only $3 a month for an extra episode or early episodes or ad-free episodes and a bunch of other perks that you can check out on patreon.com.
We talk about the history of Christmas, how it relates to our families. It's a ball of a time. It's a Yuletide time.
And just Pop Canada in general is a pretty fun show if you just want to sit back and not have to think about sometimes the heavy topics like this episode that we're talking about. So honestly, check it out. Or if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about anything that we talked about today, or any of the extra episodes that we just mentioned, you can reach out to us through email, Facebook, Twitter. All the links are in the description. If you want to support the show through other ways, you can do so through PayPal donations or through the affiliate links on the recommended reading page. Which
we get a little kickback every time you buy our books or the books that we talk about.
Yep, definitely.
Talking about books, God, I can't even remember the last time we did that.
Well, I mean, we talked a bit about The Emigrant last episode.
Yeah, that's true.
Which was a book-length poem.
Yay!
But, yeah, obviously all of this is optional. The show is still going to be here, even if you don't decide to support us through there. And finally, the last thing I'm going to say before we log off, please share the show and review it on iTunes. It helps boost our listenership, and honestly, it helps get a feel of what people are into and just what exactly people like to hear. You know?
Remember, people, take pride in what you listen to. We were rated as the number 7 historical Canadian podcast on FeedSpot recently.
That's right. I forgot to mention that. Thank you for reminding me, Mac. We somehow made it onto a list.
A very specific list. I gotta wonder if there's only 15 Canadian podcasts about Canadian history.
At this point, I don't care.
We're still better than 8 of other ones, so woo-hoo.
Yeah. There are a bunch of Canadian podcasts, but I know that some of them don't explicitly say it in the title, so it's not always evident to know that they're about that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, anyway, if that's it for this episode, then I'm going to wish everyone excellent health and
happy holidays.
Obviously,
see you and yours.
Certainly. I don't know if we're going to release a new episode between now and Christmas in 2 weeks, or if we're just going to release a Patreon for free. I'm not sure.
Ooh, we could do that as a Yuletide gift. Release Michael Bublé.
Sure.
Release
not?
Michael Bublé from his cave. That makes sense in context of our episode. Just saying.
Happy holidays, whether we see you before the new year or not. You're all amazing people, and we wish everyone the best of health.